Hello, grade 8 learner. Welcome to your video lesson in mathematics, where we will be discussing how to determine the possible outcomes of a given probability experiment. This is based on the K-12 curriculum learning competency. The learner counts the number of occurrences of an outcome in an experiment through the fundamental counting principle. It's another great day to learn, so prepare your module, pen, and paper as you start watching and learning from this video lesson. Refer to your quarter 4 module entitled Fundamental Counting Principle for this lesson. Given that you can only choose one vegetable, one fruit, and one meat in the community pantry, we are tasked to determine the possible outcomes for each of the following situations. To do that, we observe what is given in the problem. We determine the elements of the sample space by looking at the choices that we have to make. We can choose one vegetable from sayote, repolyo, broccoli, and carrots. We can choose one fruit from banana, apple, and orange. Finally, we can choose one meat from pork and fish. Let us process what we know. In a previous video lesson, we discussed about how a treat diagram can be used to solve a probability problem like the one given here. In this video lesson, we are going to show another method that you can use to solve this problem. To be able to answer the questions we are given, we can use the fundamental counting principle. This states that if one thing can occur in a number of m ways, a second thing can occur in n ways, and a third thing can occur in p ways, and so on, then the sequence of these things can occur in m times n times p ways. Simply put, we are going to multiply the number of ways that different events can occur. That's why this principle can also be called as the multiplication rule. Let us solve the problem. To know how many possible combinations of vegetable, fruit, and meat we can make, we apply the fundamental counting principle. We determine the number of possible vegetable, fruit, and meat choices that we can have and multiply them all together. Thus, we have 4 times 3 times 2, which is equal to 24. The second question we are given tells us to solve for the total number of outcomes that show or contain fish. In applying the multiplication rule, we are still going to multiply the number of possible vegetable, fruit, and meat choices together. Thus, we have 4 vegetable choices multiplied by 3 fruit choices. But for the number of meat choices, there will only be one since we will only consider fish as the choice of meat to answer the question. Thus, we get 12 as a result. To answer the third question, we still apply the multiplication rule, but we have to take note that we are looking at outcomes that contain repolyo and orange together. We are going to have only one vegetable choice since we are going to consider only repolyo for vegetable. We multiply that to the only choice we have for fruit, which is orange. We multiply that also to the number of meat choices, which is 2, since the problem does not limit the meat choices. Thus, we get 2 as our product. To answer the last question, we are going to take 2 steps in our solution because we are looking at the outcomes that contain either sayote or pork. The first step is to determine the number of outcomes that show sayote. This means we are only going to have one choice for vegetable, which is sayote. We multiply that to the number of fruit choices, which is 3, since it is not limited by the problem. Lastly, we multiply the result to the number of meat choices available, which is 2, because we can also consider outcomes that contain both sayote and pork. This results to 6, which is the number of outcomes that show sayote. The second step to answer the fourth question is to determine the number of outcomes that show pork. We begin with the number of vegetable choices, which will now be 3 since sayote was already chosen. We multiply that to the number of fruit choices, which is 3 since there is again no limit for fruit choices. Finally, we multiply the result to the number of meat choices, which will now be only 1 since only pork should be chosen. Thus, we get a result which is 9. That shows the number of outcomes that show pork without sayote being chosen. Now we take the outcomes that show sayote, add that to the number of outcomes that show pork, to get the number of outcomes that show sayote or pork. This means we add 6 and 9 together to get a total of 15. Now that we've finished solving, we state our conclusions. Given vegetable, fruit, and meat choices in the community pantry, we get a total of 24 possible combinations if we choose one vegetable, one fruit, and one meat. There are 12 outcomes in all that show fish. There are only 2 outcomes that show repolyo and orange in our choices, while there are 15 outcomes in all that contain either sayote or pork. Congratulations for finishing this video lesson. Now apply what you've learned by answering the activities in the activity sheet. Happy learning! We'll see you again in our next video lesson.